So welcome everyone. My name's Andrea Warnick and I'm a child grief counselor, and I work with a lot of families where somebody has cancer or some other illness and are really trying to figure out how to prepare the kids, how much to tell the kids, is there information they shouldn't be telling kids. And this is a topic that I'm really passionate about because of my experience. I'm a nurse by training. I spent a lot of time doing pediatric oncology nursing, and I did some adult palliative care nursing as well. And I found that whether I was working with a child who had cancer or adults, there were always kids coming into the hospital who had very little information about their sibling or their parent or their grandparent's cancer diagnosis. And sometimes it would even be a situation where a parent might be dying of cancer and kids are coming into the hospital, and we find out that the children have never even been told the parent had cancer, let alone that the parent is now dying. And it was always an incredibly difficult situation to be in. And I remember as a nurse, I would kind of think, okay, I did not get any training for this in nursing school, and so I would go run out and look for the social worker and hope that they got more training, only to find out that social workers really didn't have any specific training to this either. And then we'd go looking for the chaplains and find out the chaplains didn't have any training, and the physicians were feeling really ill-equipped to help families navigate these situations. And especially to be in a room with a child and have to have that type of conversation with them. As a result, I ended up one day going back and doing a master's in thanatology, which is actually a master's in dying and death, and learning more about counseling techniques and just really sort of the history of children and illness and death and dying and everything. And it became really interesting to me to see how historically kids were always around the bedside when someone was dying. Often people were dying at home, and really there wasn't a whole lot of thought put into trying to keep information around illness and death and dying away from kids. It was a part of life. It was accepted as a part of life, and so kids tended to be more in the loop. And in the last 100 years, there's been so many changes on that front, where people, when they're ill, are often in hospital more. They may be coming back, but often if a death is occurring, it does tend to be in a hospital or a nursing home and not happening as much in the home. And so children aren't around it as much as they used to be. And a lot of families really struggle just knowing, is it going to be traumatic if I tell my child too much? And all of that with the backdrop of, in our hospital systems, there are not many people, as I mentioned, who feel equipped to guide families in this area. And so, while there has been research showing that families want guidance when they receive a cancer diagnosis in terms of how much to tell their kids and how to do it, very few people are actually getting that. And often families don't even ask for it because it's not being offered. And as a result of that, my passion really became getting to know the resources and spending a lot of time in terms of not only working with families directly by counseling them or talking to families over the phone and giving them guidance how to do it, but also the education piece and just getting out there and educating as many people as possible to change some of the culture around how we do this and hopefully help more people feel comfortable really supporting their kids and being able to have more open communication with their kids when there is an illness in the family. So in terms of the objectives today, one of the pieces I really want to look at are, what are the barriers? Why is this so hard to talk to children? How come it's such a scary experience for healthcare professionals, educators, and of course parents and grandparents? And the other piece being, like, what are some strategies? Like, actually hoping that people will take away some strategies so the next time they're in a situation like this, or if they're in a situation like this right now, that people can feel more comfortable being able to engage kids, no matter how young they are, in conversations around what's happening and really include them, perhaps feeling more comfortable bringing them to a hospital to visit. Even if it's a situation where, grandma or mom or dad, whoever the family members are, if someone's dying in the hospital, knowing that it's okay to bring kids in, if kids want that, giving the kids the option. And the other objective there being really, what are some of the resources that exist? There are a lot of web resources out there about how to talk to kids about cancer. There are resources specifically for healthcare professionals and educators as well. And so when we look at the barriers, what's really holding people back and making this work so hard in the first place, there has been research done showing that one of the biggest fears for healthcare professionals is the fear of saying the wrong thing. The fear that they'll give some guidance and it might be the wrong thing, and the parent will end up going home and doing the wrong thing, or the healthcare professional will be saying it directly to the child and it will mess up the child. And I really believe that for parents, this is a huge barrier as well for talking about what's happening in the family. And as a result, everybody seems to be defaulting on not giving kids information in hopes that they won't say the wrong thing. But I really believe in the bigger picture, we're doing more harm to kids by not giving them information, because kids are smart and they're little detectives. And so many of the kids that I sit down with, I'll start off with saying, you know, what's your understanding of what's happening right now in your family? And a lot of them already know. And they may not know the exact details, and they may have a lot of misconceptions around it, but a lot of them have heard parents whispering, they've overheard telephone conversations, they know something's going on, even though often their families think like, oh, they don't know, we've hidden this really well. And a big concern as well, and I hear this over and over again from the families that I work with, is I'm going to increase my child's worry. They'll worry more if I tell them that this is happening. And, you know, I might be cured, so why bother burdening them with this? You know, I don't want to be known as the mom with cancer or the dad with cancer, and so I don't want my child to be worried. And in Canada, at least, any child 6 and over who's heard of Terry Fox will often equate cancer with death. So that scares a lot of families. What happens if my child starts asking questions around death and dying? And so a lot of parents think that we're going to protect our kids by not giving them information about what's happening. But the research in this area has been very consistent as well. And all of it is saying is the less information we give kids, the less open communication there is in a family, the higher kids' anxiety is going to go. So it's the exact opposite of what a lot of people suspect will happen. And that's why, from my perspective, there's never a too early to start talking to kids about these things. But there's always a too late. And as a nurse in the hospital, I was seeing the situations of the too late over and over again. A lot of people, and I think this is particularly true for healthcare professionals as well, are terrified of the emotional reactions that are going to come up when they tell children bad news. And I do think this is true for parents too, worried that what happens if I talk to my child about my cancer and the child is devastated? What am I going to do with that? And that's a huge barrier. And the fact is, yes, a lot of kids are devastated. And it can be a really emotional conversation. But what we'll talk about today is the key to these conversations is not feeling that you have to fix it. You don't have to fix the emotions, whether you're a healthcare professional, whether you're a grandparent or a parent or a loved aunt or uncle. The job is not to fix the child's pain, but be able to just be with them in that. Those reactions are totally healthy reactions if a child's devastated. There's nothing wrong with that. And what we want to teach kids is that this is a human response to having something really hard happen. And, you know, as I've already mentioned, that there's really a complete gap in terms of training. It is missed in most curriculums, whether you're an educator, whether you're a healthcare professional, in terms of how do we talk to kids about these things. And at most hospitals and most adult cancer centers, it is not going to be on anyone's job description to be the person who's in charge of making sure that families know how to guide their children through this. So for healthcare professionals, it's not even necessarily needing to be in the same room with the children and have the conversation, although if that can happen, that's fabulous. but more of one of being able to guide families. Because any person who gets a cancer diagnosis, who has dependent children at home, one of the first questions they're going to be thinking is, what do I tell my children? And then I think that in the big picture, we also have to keep in mind that we're dealing with a really almost a grief-phobic society, certainly a death-phobic society, but in terms of general grief about the hard things that are happening in life, whether it's a cancer diagnosis or some other devastating thing has happened, we don't do grief well. A lot of people are uncomfortable with intensity of emotions, and we feel that to be strong is to keep everything contained, and so it really leaves a lot of people really sort of struggling to know, how do we do the hard stuff? How do we make room for our suffering? And perhaps afraid that if we speak of our suffering and of this thing that is happening, being a cancer diagnosis, maybe it will make it more true. It can almost feel less true if we don't speak of it. And talking to kids who are going to talk about it quite openly, and they should. That's what we hope for them. We don't want them to feel like they shouldn't be talking about these things. But that can present an additional barrier for families. And a bunch of this we've already covered, but really just showing that for professionals, it's our anxieties about saying the wrong thing, causing long-lasting emotional damage. And I always try to remind people, you actually have to say the wrong thing a lot of times to kids before you're going to really mess them up with it. So, there's been a number of times in my counseling practice, I'll explain something to a child and I realize, you know what, I don't really like how I explained that, or I think I could have done a better job, or maybe it wasn't even accurate. And I will ask if I can go back and explain it again. And as long as we continue to have access to the children, that's always an option. In the cases of when, a child's maybe in a hospital and visiting grandma as she's dying or has been diagnosed with cancer, it's a different situation. And it might be that the healthcare professionals have a one-shot deal for being able to talk to that child. But even there, the important thing to remember is that if children ask questions that we don't know the answers to, it's absolutely okay to say, I don't know. And so as long as we're being guided by being honest and using simple information and being okay not having the answers, usually we're not going to say the wrong thing and cause any sort of emotional damage. We're going to do more emotional damage by not talking about it at all. And the piece by Kroll just showing that, again, children's anxiety goes up with the less information that they're given. And part of the reason is because kids' imaginations are so active. Because kids, if we don't tell them what's happening, they're really egocentric. They think the whole world revolves around them. So if they do something bad's going to happen. If they do something good, then good things will happen. And so if something bad happens, such as someone having a cancer diagnosis, kids will often feel responsible. And if people aren't talking to them about it, then we leave it up to their imaginations as to why this has happened in their lives. And that's the exact reason for this talk. Daddy swallowed a lollipop and got cancer. I worked with a family where a little boy was absolutely convinced that dad's mouth cancer was caused by dad swallowing a lollipop that the child gave him, and it got stuck in his throat, and for sure he got cancer. And the fact is, dad never got a lollipop stuck in his throat. The little boy did give him a lollipop, but absolutely that had nothing to do with dad's cancer. And we didn't find out until months and months and months down the road that the child had been feeling entirely responsible for dad's cancer. And I've heard everything from, mom yelled at me to clean up my room so much that it caused her to get mouth cancer, or I stressed my parents out so much that caused cancer. So one day I would love to write a book specifically on all the things I've heard from really young kids to teenagers about how they felt responsible in some way for the cancer that happened to their family. And this is particularly true, I find, when a sibling has a cancer diagnosis. Because often kids can feel pretty resentful of all the attention that the sibling with cancer is getting. And so they can feel frustrated with the sibling, want them just to go away, not have them around and everything, or have things return to where they got equal attention. And so the kids can often end up feeling guilty about the thoughts that they have associated with that, which is one of the reasons that we just want to normalize all of these feelings that are all tied up and can be bundled up and called grief, essentially, as being natural human responses to the situation. And this is just a really short list of all the myths and misconceptions that are out there. But I think, language is really powerful, and we often underestimate that. And often, for all of the right reasons, I'll work with families who have decided not to use the C word, not to call it cancer. So perhaps instead they're saying, well, grandma is sick, grandma is sick. Not realizing, that the next time dad comes home sick, with a cold or the flu or whatever, the child will think it's the exact same thing, or mommy has a bad back, and then the child hearing that somebody else has a bad back and thinking it's the same thing. And kids aren't socialized the way we are to fear the word cancer. So by using the word cancer, it actually helps make the situation less scary to the child. It may be that mom can't get up and do the same things with the kids that she would normally do after her chemotherapy. And so being able to explain, it's not that mom doesn't want to do these things with you anymore, but when she has chemotherapy because of her cancer, it makes her really tired, or maybe the cancer is making her really tired. But it's not that mom doesn't want to do these things. So for a lot of kids, it can actually be reassuring to know that it's the cancer that's causing some of the big changes in their life, not the person who's experiencing it. A lot of families will say, well, if the child's not talking about it, then why should we? If the child starts asking us questions, then we'll start talking. But there's research showing as well that with even young children who have cancer themselves, if they perceive that the adults in their life are uncomfortable with the topic, they're going to be very careful and quickly go into protective modes of the adults and not bring up the topic. Right? And a lot of this research was done around specifically children who were dying. But this is something that I see all the time, is that kids are trying to protect their parents every bit as much as parents are trying to protect their kids. And so we really shouldn't be leaving it up to kids to take the lead on these kinds of conversations. It's important that families are able to say to kids, you know what, this is what's happening, and you can ask any questions. And it's not that we want to overload children with information. They've got short attention spans for this kind of stuff. But at least let them take the lead in the sense that we open up the discussion, say that they can ask anything. There are no bad questions. If we don't know the answer, we'll be honest with them about not having the answer. But they can ask, and really checking in with the child every now and then, giving them bits of information, but really encouraging them and letting them know that they can ask anything, even if it's a hard conversation to have. And I think the essence of why this is so difficult for families to figure out how to navigate is this instinct, this natural born instinct of wanting to protect kids. And that's where I think it's so important to really help families shift that from wanting to protect their kids to trying to prepare their kids, and just sort of shift the mentality around it from one of that a job as a parent or any caregiver of a child is not just to protect them from all of the hard things in life. Because by the nature of being human, kids are going to experience hard things in life. There's no way around that. But our job as the adults in their lives is really to prepare them for the hard stuff. And the piece about kids not being at the bedside of the dying is a complete myth. Historically, when kids were always around the bedside, and even a lot of, throughout the world still, kids tend to be at the bedside. They're not all traumatized as a result of that. And I always find it so interesting how in Western culture, we seem to be okay with removing kids from natural death, whether it's the family goldfish that's died and people just want to rush out and replace it with a new goldfish, or whether it's that, a close family member has died. But we've thought to remove kids from that, yet it's at a time where they're exposed to more violent death and unnatural death. than ever before through the media and through video games and everything else, which is why so many kids will often think that if somebody has a cancer diagnosis, that all of a sudden it's just going to be boom, the person's going to die. And that's why it's really important to be able to talk to kids about the fact that that's not true. A lot of people have cancer and will survive cancer. And if someone has cancer and will not survive and is going to die from their cancer, usually there's some warning signs around that. And I find one of the biggest concerns too, a lot of parents thinking, why would I tell my child about this? Because they're just going to think about it all of the time. And you know, if it is a situation where down the road I relapse or I am dying, then we'll tell them, but let's protect them for as long as possible. And again, that doesn't work so well because kids usually know way more than families think that they know. But kids also don't think about it all of the time. Kids grieve very differently than adults do. I use this picture here from a group of kids I worked with after the tsunami in 2004. And these guys lived in Sri Lanka, and a lot of the kids who were living in the orphanage they were in were killed. And these kids were running around a month later playing, having fun, laughing. They didn't always look like this. Sometimes they looked absolutely devastated, staring off into space, rocking themselves, but some of the times they looked like this. And that's even in the face of such significant trauma that most of us can't even imagine experiencing. And that's how kids grieve. They really grieve in chunks. We'll see it often, you know, at funerals where a child might be weeping one moment and running around playing the next. You know, that's totally healthy, and that's how they do it. And they're going to grieve in chunks, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well. So it might be that a 4-year-old, if, say, grandma dies, 4-year-old's going to grieve at a 4-year-old level and think about sort of the more immediate impact. But then when the 4-year-old's 8, they might start thinking about it in terms of the bigger picture. Oh, like I'm going to a new school and grandma's not actually here. And start digesting it at that level, which can bring a lot of the grief back up to the surface. And that's completely healthy, and that's how they do it. But I've had so many families call me surprised after I'll guide them through how to tell their child that somebody's been diagnosed with cancer. The child may be completely devastated, and then 6 minutes later wants to go out and play hockey. And that's how they do it. And it doesn't mean they don't love the person. It doesn't mean there's not a strong emotional attachment. When they have had too much, they're going to emotionally regulate it and turn it off and go do something else. And they also have a remarkable ability to really balance deep sorrow in one hand and joy in the other, and do the both at the same time in the way many of us as adults don't. So these are some of the key principles for communicating with kids. And even though this is specific to cancer, this could actually apply to pretty much any illness that's being experienced in the family. Again, whether it's a child, whether it's a parent, a grandparent, a friend. And really the key comes down to being honest, being completely okay when we don't have the answers, and keeping in mind that piece about the power of language. Avoiding euphemisms, you know, even when it comes to death and dying, not say passed away, passed on, just calling it what it is, death and dying, or this is cancer, this is chemotherapy. So using the correct words, and even really young kids. I mean, I've worked with 2- and 3-year-olds to prepare them either because somebody in the family has cancer or some other illness, and we'll talk about it. We can say, well, your brother has a brain tumor, it's a type of cancer. A 2-year-old's not going to know what a brain tumor is or what cancer is, but they will understand, and they'll grow into understanding very quickly that it's different than a sickness. You know, so when they get sick with a cold the next time they're at daycare, they'll understand the difference, and it will be much easier for the family to really explain the difference between those two things. And really just, again, letting kids know that there are no bad questions. Any questions go. And when kids ask hard questions, particularly the ones that we don't have the answers for, it's really good to thank them and let them know that that's a fabulous question. If it's a type of situation, I don't have the answer, but maybe the oncologist does, I'll facilitate that conversation and try to find out and come back to the child and let them know that. But if it's a question, you know, why did this happen to my mom? that none of us are really going to have the answers to, I'm going to say that to them. I'll talk about nature a lot, or mystery. You know, there's some things in life that are just a mystery and we don't have the answer to, but we do know it's not your fault. In terms of where to start these conversations, if a family's going home, maybe there's been cancer in the family for a long time and kids just haven't been told, or maybe it's just happened and it's really, really raw for the family as well. The best place to start is just asking kids what they know so far. Find out where they're at. Find out how much information that they have found out about. It's always important, I think, especially for healthcare professionals and educators, to think about it as well. Get on the level of the child. Don't stand up over the child when having a conversation like this. So a lot of my sessions are spent on the floor talking to kids, maybe playing with some Play-Doh at the same time. For a lot of kids, they'll feel safer having a conversation if they can do something like that at the same time, and letting them know that they can ask me anything. And when it comes to the questions that they ask, I always want to make sure I understand what question they're actually asking. I've come up with a number of excellent answers, or I thought they were excellent answers, to questions kids are asking, only to find out that's not really what they were asking at all. So if a child asks me a question, I always want to ask, you know, I think what you're asking me is this. Is that what you're asking? And just really validating it for them. And keeping in mind the 4 C's. And I think any child who has something difficult happening in their life, even if it's a divorce, even if it's you know, an illness, any sort of windstorm that's happening, I always want people to think about the 4 C's. You know, did I cause it? Was I responsible in any way? Can I catch this? One of the things I'll always say to kids about cancer, I'll say, one of the only good things about cancer is that you can't catch it. So you can hug your dad, you can kiss him, you can get into bed, you can share food with him. You're not going to catch cancer from him. And for a lot of adults, it's not even on their radar that kids would think that way. But most of the illnesses they know about, such as colds and flus, are all things that you can catch from somebody. So really clarifying so they know that. And a lot of kids just want to know the practical too. Okay, so if mom's going to the hospital for all kinds of treatments, who is going to be taking care of me? And I think the more concrete we can get with kids, the better. So, you know, for families or therapists or anyone who has time to do these things, to be able to really draw out little pictures of cancer. You know, with like 6, 7-year-olds, I'll easily take Play-Doh out and start making Play-Doh balls and explain how cells keep dividing. The whole body's made up of cells. The more concrete we can make it, the better. It can be as simple as taking a pen and paper and just sort of drawing some pictures, or having you know, an anatomy textbook and showing a model of the body and where in the body cancer may be found. Because the more concrete it is for kids, the less likely they are to feel as though they're responsible for causing it. And that's why I've included some of these resources as well. At Kids Health, there's a whole description on how you can talk about cancer to kids. It walks people right through it. The site by CAPO, Start the Talk, specifically for educators and for healthcare professionals. I think a lot of that information is really relevant to parents as well. How do you talk about cancer? How do you explain it to kids and youth? And this would be sort of the example of having an anatomy doll or even just a textbook and being able to say, this is the liver, this is where grandpa's cancer is. And so when we're preparing kids to come to visit in a hospital, we want to tell them how much they're going to see. We want to let them know what to expect. We always want to give them a choice. You know, so if grandma's in the hospital and the child does not want to go, that's okay, but I want to understand, why does the child not want to go? What is the child scared of experiencing at the hospital? And really trying to understand the fear underneath it, because it might be that it's something that we can provide a lot of reassurance about. I've had some kids come and visit in hospital rooms where they'll just stay at the door and not actually go in and visit. Or they might, I had one little girl who gave her teddy bear a big hug and then sent the teddy bear into the bedroom to be in the bed with dad. And so she felt that her emotions could be in there. And so the sky is really the limit in terms of how to have kids be able to interact with someone who's in the hospital. But the key is that we actually give kids some of those strategies. Because so many kids will really be struggling with, I can't do the things with my uncle that I used to do with my uncle. Therefore, I don't know how to even be there in the hospital with him. So if we can give them strategies such as, you don't need to talk, you could just be doing your homework by the bedside. Or if you want to decorate the room, put up a bunch of pictures or do some drawings that you can put on the wall. And letting them know, is the person waking up? Is the person sleeping most of the time? Is there tubing in the room? All of those kind of things. You know, is grandpa maybe more confused right now because of the cancer or because of some of the meds? He might call you the wrong name. It doesn't mean he doesn't love you. It doesn't mean he doesn't care about you. It's the cancer that's causing that. And these are just a few other strategies as well in terms of what kids can do. You know, painting toes. Kids can go in, even if somebody's in a situation where they have advanced cancer and maybe grandma's not waking up anymore. But having kids be able to paint grandma's toes or put moisturizer cream on her. The picture is of a hug. And all that is a strip of a blanket or a sheet, and then the child can trace their arms and they can send their hug to be with the person in the hospital, or if somebody's at home with an illness as well. But it gives kids a way to be involved so they don't feel like they're on the sidelines and they're actually able to participate and feel like they're a part of what's happening in the family. And there's things that even though they cannot take the cancer away, that is not their job, and it's not something they have the power to do. We need them to understand they cannot cure it. So we use all these medicines and everything, and sometimes the cancer is even too strong for the medicines. But we do need kids to understand that if it's not cured, it is not through the fault of the child in any way. A number of kids have told me about secret pacts they had made in their heads that, you know, they would never fight with their sibling again as long as their sibling was cured of cancer. And then, of course, the siblings fight. And if the sibling isn't cured and actually dies, a lot of kids will carry that for a long, long time with them. So again, before kids are identifying any of these 4 C's, just knowing as adults in their life that these are issues that a lot of kids are thinking about, we can introduce them and just reassure them that they're not responsible, they're not going to catch it, and they will be taken care of. And I think with kids, no matter how young they are, one of the most important tools we can give them in terms of this really difficult situation and any of the windstorms that they're going to be dealing with in life is really emotional literacy tools. And I think that this is often overlooked in a lot of our education systems as well. But helping kids learn emotions and identify emotions, and that can be as simple as having a 2-year-old reading any book with the 2-year-old and saying, oh, I wonder what that character's feeling. What do you think this character's feeling? Why do you think they're feeling that way? And really just helping them identify emotions and how people will often act when they're having these different emotions. So any kids I work with, I want to make sure they understand the word grief, that it's something that we all experience at different times in life. Grief can be something that we have lots of in the inside, but you can't even tell on the outside sometimes. And I'll always include, this is a short list of the words that I'll include when I'm talking about grief, but I always want to make sure that happy is down there too. And it doesn't mean that the kids are happy that this has happened in their life, but that it's okay, even if someone really close to you has cancer, it's still okay to be happy and enjoy life. And this is just another, some other tools that can be used to help kids identify emotions, feelings charts. For little kids, you can use far more or far less feelings. And with the older kids, I would use a complex one, like a more complex one on this slide. But for a lot of kids, they're not going to sit down and open up with the adults in their life and have big conversations about all of this. They might be really short conversations, hopefully ongoing conversations. And if we can help them find ways, especially for kids who aren't as verbal, to still identify their feelings and be able to communicate those feelings to other people in their life, can really help them in this situation and beyond. And so some of the things we want to think about in terms of really supporting kids has to do with that identification of feelings and sort of differentiating between that and their behaviors. So in terms of, if I've got a 4-year-old who's maybe really upset because somebody has cancer in the family or something else really hard has happened, and they're kicking their best friend at school all the time, we want to make sure that we teach the 4-year-old that your feelings that are happening when you're kicking are totally okay. The feelings are always okay. Your behavior, kicking your best friend, is not okay. So the consequence is for the behavior, not for your feelings. And really trying to separate those out. And that's all tied into the emotional literacy piece of helping kids identify emotions, become more aware of them, and be able to understand the difference between emotions and behavior. And for so many kids, again, they're not going to sit down and just talk about these things, but a lot of it is for us to be able to model grief and what it's like to be in the hard times in life where there is suffering. You know, and that can look like too, as a parent, if you've recently received a diagnosis or perhaps the illness is getting worse, being okay crying and showing emotions in front of kids and letting them know, yes, I'm really upset, yes, I'm really sad, but I'm okay. And where I think it's important to draw a line is if it's a situation where perhaps you're on the floor weeping and seeming really out of control, that can be hard and scary for kids to see. So if possible, I encourage families, you know, not to do that in front of the kids, but in terms of crying or just feeling more tired or frustrated or maybe being a bit more short-tempered, being able to talk to kids that that's all a part of our grief. As adults, we have this too. This is not stuff you just experience as a kid, because if we're only going to show our emotions behind closed doors, then kids are going to think that it's okay that I feel all these things when I'm a kid, but when I'm an adult, I really shouldn't be feeling these things anymore. And we know that that's not true. And for a lot of kids, because they want to strongly protect their parents and the adults in their life, we need to let them know too, you know what, if you start talking about this, or if we're having a conversation about my cancer and I start crying, it's not that you've made me sad, it's because I have this sadness inside and you're actually helping me get it out. Because kids will very quickly default to not talking about something if they think, well, every time I bring this up, somebody cries, I'm not going to bring this up. And we want to teach them that it's still okay to bring them up and it's actually helpful to get the sad feelings out. And my last point there is really that consistency equals predictability equals control. And it can be incredibly hard when somebody has cancer in the family and all of the routines and everything are sort of thrown out the window and there's so many medical appointments and there's just not the same energy that there was there before. And that's okay. But in terms of what we can keep consistent, it's important to do that. Right? So in terms of bedtimes, rules, you know, if it wasn't okay to be rude and talk back to your parents before, it's not okay now. You know, and I've worked with so many families where around a cancer diagnosis, there'll be a period of sort of overindulging the kids and just feeling so sad for them, for everything that's going on right now. And that always ends up being difficult down the road for the family. And that's why the more consistent families can be with the kids, the more predictable the kid's environment is. And even if they're pushing back against that, it's actually on a subtle level reinforcing their sense of security in the world. And that can really help them learn to control their emotions and their behavior better than when it's unpredictable. So I'm going to finish up. I have a few slides of, these are some of my favorite resources for children. There's a ton of resources out there for kids when there is cancer in their life or for kids who have cancer themselves. It's just really important to read through them first before you read through them with your child and make sure that you're comfortable with all of the language that's being used. The bottom website there it's got tons of books, and I've not read all of those books, but a lot of books. Specifically for kids of all different ages about cancer. And then these are some of my favorite resources for adults. All of the resources I've read, I know really well, they're excellent. And there's a lot of web resources available as well. So there's one there called Telling Kids About Cancer, and it literally walks people through how to have conversations with children about cancer. I've also included my own information there because I spend a lot of time not only doing a private in-person counseling practice, but just guiding families over the phone anywhere in North America on how to have these conversations or support kids who are experiencing grief of any kind. And I'm going to finish with this quote by Dr. Wendy Harpham because I think it's really the essence of what we've addressed here today. And that is that the greatest gift you can give your children is not protection from change, loss, pain, or stress, but the confidence and tools to cope and grow with all that life has to offer them. Thank you.